It is I, Lady Hexerai, once again, to bring you the good news about witchcraft. Today we'll explore the second chapter of the book Caliban and the Witch, Woman, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation, by philosopher Sylvia Federici. In this video, we'll explore the meaning of money in a capitalist society and how it led to a revolution in society that has lasted over 4 centuries. After the enclosures and privatization of land, the peasants lost the common land and became landless. Now the poor peasants had no choice but to sell the only thing they had left, their labor power, and it started to be bought way cheaper than its real value. It was either exploitation or starvation that awaited them. They either turned to wage work or became beggars or vagabonds. In feudal times, no matter how restricted the peasants were, there was still some natural affiliation with the land he farmed and the roof he lived under. When commutation first emerged, it was seen as a new form of freedom, but without the commons, it became an even tighter chain than the feudal obligations. This chain was a noose around the neck of the burgeoning proletariat, a chain raising them far into the air because of what has become known as the price revolution.
Did you say revolution?
Not that kind, boy. Bring me more potion.
Oh.
With every cause there is an effect. The theft of land and an enslavement of the native populations in the Americas returned to Europe 1,000-fold or more. The Spanish raped and enslaved their way through Central and Southern America. The enslaved natives were forced to mine precious metals, which would be exported by the literal boatloads back to Europe. Did this huge supply of silver, which was brought from the Americas to Spain, stay in Spain? Of course not! It was circulated all over Europe as fast as it poured in. The kings of Spain fought one series of stupid wars after another, paying their soldiers in gold and silver. The Spaniards bought more goods than they sold. They couldn't eat the silver. Their money filtered through the hands into the pockets of the merchants who sold to them. The rapid influx of gold and silver created an inflationary phenomenon hitherto unseen. Yet, Sister Federici notes the unique circumstances that allowed an increase in precious metals to have such devastating inflationary outcomes. Quote, if they, gold and silver, functioned as price-regulating devices capable of turning even wheat into a precious commodity, this was because they were planted into a developing capitalist world, in which a growing percentage of the population, 1/3 in England, had no access to land and had to buy the food that they had once produced, and because the ruling class had learned to use the magical power of money to cut labor costs. In other words, prices rose because of the development of a national and international market system, encouraging the export-import of agricultural products, and because merchants hoarded goods to sell them later at a higher price. It was under these circumstances that the arrival of the American treasure triggered a massive redistribution of wealth and new proletarianization process. Rising prices ruined the small farmers, who had to give up their land to buy grain or bread when the harvest could not feed their families, and created a class of capitalist entrepreneurs who accumulated fortunes by investing in agriculture and money lending, at a time when money was for many people a matter of life or death. Wages fell by huge numbers. In 1600 in Spain, real wages lost 30% of their purchasing power compared to 1511. From the year 1540 to 1800, wages in England fell by 2/3. In France, wages dropped 60% from 1470 to 1570. For women, like myself, the consequences were more severe. In the 14th century, women made half of what men did in wage work, but by 1600, it was only 1/3 of a man's. Is it any wonder that during this period, the oldest known profession, prostitution, skyrocketed? Here you can see the wage devaluation in southern England, Alsace, and France from 1440 to 1640. In this graph, you can see the skyrocketing price of grain in England over 2 centuries. While capitalists would have you believe that this is the invisible hand of the market, nothing could be further from the truth. Sister Federici says, this was not the work of the invisible hand of the market, but the product of a state policy that prevented laborers from organizing, while giving merchants the maximum freedom with regard to the pricing and movement of goods. What followed was the absolute impoverishment of the European working class, a phenomena so widespread in general that, by 1550 and long after, Workers in Europe were referred to as simply the poor. The face of exploitation had now grown worse in this transition. The hatred and resentment amongst the workers against wage labor intensified. According to Sister Federici, quote, such was the hatred that workers felt for wage labor that Gerard Winstanley, the leader of the diggers, declared that it did not make any difference whether one lived under the enemy or under one's brother, if one worked for a wage. This explains the growth in the wake of the enclosures of the number of vagabonds and masterless men who preferred to take to the road and to risk enslavement or death rather than to work for a wage. The age of property and trade was also the age of beggars. It is true, the figures for the number of beggars during the 16th and 17th century are astounding. 1/4 of the population of Paris in 1630 were beggars. In England, conditions were equally bad. Holland teemed with beggars, and in Switzerland, when there was no means of getting rid of beggars who besieged their houses and wandered in bands about the roads and forests, the wealthy even organized hunting parties against these wretched homeless ones. What is the explanation for this widespread distress for the masses in a time of such great prosperity? Well, this prosperity was only for the few. Migration, vagabondage, crimes against property, poaching, theft were all forms of resistance against wage slavery. This graph shows the correlation between price increases and property crimes in Essex from 1566 to 1602. What a surprise! Sister Federici says, quote, pauperization, rebellion, and the escalation of quote-unquote crime are structural elements of capitalist accumulation, as capitalism must strip the workforce from its means of reproduction to impose its own rule. Mercantilism demanded the lengthening of the working day to maximum hours, and the reduction of wages to a minimum. Our warlock friend Marx defined this as the exploitation to create the absolute surplus of value. The lengths mercantilism went to achieve absolute surplus of wealth makes thoughtless, liberal-minded capitalists from the First World blush, and has led to many capitalist theorists dismissing it as a crude or vulgar theory for understanding economics. Mercantilism was the teenage jock that never took no for an answer. Sister Federici said, quote, the brutal means which the mercantilists applied in order to force people to work and their hunger for labor have contributed to their disrepute, as most economists wish to maintain the illusion that capitalism fosters freedom rather than coercion. It was the mercantilist class that invented workhouses, hunted down vagabonds, transported criminals to the American colonies, and invested in the slave trade, all the while asserting the utility of poverty and declaring idleness a social plague. Mercantilism expressed primitive accumulation in its purest and most brutal forms. It was, quote, the first capitalist policy explicitly addressing the problem of the reproduction of the workforce. Fear not, my dear viewers. My wand and I shall explain. Mercantilism pictured human beings as mere raw materials, workers and breeders for the benefit and wealth of the state. So brutal were the tactics of the moneymakers. The state had to criminalize vagabondage or any diminishment of the workforce. The state supported the creation of workhouses that ground the working man to his limits, and if that was unsuccessful, one could just easily be labeled insane or a criminal for one's irrational idleness and sent to a correctional house for forced labor. But with every stick comes a carrot. By the mid-16th century, at least 60 European cities had public assistance programs. As meager and humiliating as the poor rates were, this no doubt helped prevent the flight of some labor from factories. However, many places required internments in the above-mentioned workhouses to receive assistance. Preventing the flight of people was essential for mercantilism. In the mid-16th century, the view that the number of citizens directly determines a nation's wealth was considered self-evident. French political thinker and demonologist Jean Bodin said, quote, one should never be afraid of having too many subjects or too many citizens, for the strength of the commonwealth consists in men. Italian economist Giovanni Botero declared the greatness of a city depended exclusively on the number of its residents. Sister Federici says, quote, the introduction of public assistance was a turning point in the state relation between workers and capital, and the definition of the function of the state. It was the first recognition of the unsustainability of a capitalist system ruling exclusively by means of hunger and terror. It was also the first step in the reconstruction of the state as the guarantor of the class relation, and as the chief supervisor of the reproduction and disciplining of the workforce. This is something the naive often forget. In capitalism, there's no such thing as a state in opposition to the desires of capital. The state in a capitalist society is a capitalist state, whose goal is to uphold the capitalist system of political economy. Whether bailing out the banks in the second millennia or the Elizabethan poor rates of the 16th century, a capitalist state's duty is to bail out capitalism from its own inherent contradictions. As Sister Federici wisely notes, quote, "It was with the introduction of public assistance that the state began to claim ownership of the workforce, and a capitalist division of labor was instituted within the ruling class, enabling employers to relinquish any responsibility for the reproduction of workers, in the certainty that the state would intervene." We see the same thing today, where massive corporations rely on the state to give their impoverished workers state assistance, to offset the poverty wages the workers receive. Meanwhile, profits are in the billions. So much for the personal responsibility of the capitalist entrepreneurs. Huh! I, Lady Hexerai, will see all you lovely people in the next video. Bye! Special thanks to you, Srepet, for supporting the channel on Patreon!